One of the most important things about you as an individual is really the heart of the matter, is getting to the matter of the heart. And our guest today is Nate Brooks, and he's written a book called Identifying Heart Transformation, exploring different kinds of human change. I know that this is a subject that I think about a lot, especially considering the fact that I'm in a teaching ministry. I'm also a pastor. I'm wondering, what effect does all of this work actually have on the people I'm entrusted with, especially our listeners and you, our viewers? What value does any of this have in helping you in that transformation process? That's why I've always been drawn to the subject of the changing of the heart, and why I'm privileged to be joined today by Nate Brooks. I'm really excited to get into the content of this book, but Nate, thank you so much for being a part of the many voices for that one message.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Adam. I love what you're saying there. Really, the heart is the center of who we are as people, and what who we are in our hearts is ultimately who we are. So I'm excited to
Yeah.
talk with you about that.
Well, I'm excited because I think that you have written a book that addresses what a lot of other books address in part. A lot of books are written on how to grow in your spiritual life or how to grow in your prayer life, but you actually address the very center of that is how do you change at the very ground level? How do you actually make any transformation in your life? We all want to grow in different areas, and there are books for those different areas, but you're getting back to the
Mhm.
very core of how we grow at all.
Yeah, that was the goal. I think you're right. Anytime we have change inside of us that is honoring to the Lord, it ultimately requires a change of our hearts. And the good news is that Jesus came and uh, lived his life, died his death, rose again specifically to enable our hearts to change.
Mhm.
And so, when we're thinking about heart transformation, we are talking about gospel truths and so many books that are written on, how to be more peaceable and less angry, or how to step away from anxiety and into peace and faith. Really, they are talking about heart transformation, but it's talking about it more in like one particular aspect of heart transformation. And I tried to write a book that was kind of, maybe the rebar and concrete underneath the frame of the house, if you will.
Yeah, I love what you're doing here. And I think it's so important because we often don't spend enough time in the kitchen. We're at the table. We want to experience what somebody else has done. One of my favorite quotes by A.W. Tozer, he says in The Pursuit of God, how tragic that we have had our seeking done for us by our teachers. We're really benefiting off of somebody
Mhm.
else's hard work, but we're not going through that process. Nobody likes to see what happens in the kitchen, right? We just want to be able to enjoy the meal once it's prepared. But you're inviting us into the kitchen to learn how it's all done in the sense of what's really happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, that's the goal. I mean, really, the origin point of this book was I and you and all the listeners here, I'm sure, have heard statements like, only Christians can experience real change, or only Christians can experience lasting change. And I think probably all of us, when we stop and think about that statement, it actually doesn't really hold water. It sounds good and it sounds right. And I think it's trying to convey something that is true, that there is something different about Christian change than just the run of the mill change that everybody can experience. But at the end of the day, all of us probably know somebody, who was some alcohol-ridden wastrel in college or high school or whatever, who has kind of come to a point of having a stable career and a family and is a productive member of society, and didn't meet Jesus along the way. And so, really, I wrote this book for myself, is trying to explore what is legitimate, genuine Christian change that is different from other forms of change, and how do we understand that?
Hmm. Now, tell us a little bit about your background because I think that that plays a kind of central role in all of this when we're talking about change and transformation. This is something that you're pursuing, you're doing, and you're actually doing in a practical sense of helping people.
Yeah, so I have kind of two main roles. I am a seminary professor, um, about to start teaching at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in Wake Forest. So I'm an associate professor of counseling there. So our program is focused on kind of redemption centric transformation. And then I also have my own private practice in counseling. I do a lot of abuse and trauma counseling and have a team that I work with there. So, most of my day is spent helping people consider what's going on inside of them. I tell my counselees that my main role is to help them interpret themselves rightly, and then also interpret the scriptures rightly, and interpret their relationships rightly, and kind of put them together towards personal growth and transformation.
Mm. As someone who is both teaching counseling and doing it on the front lines, I find it interesting how you've written a book on transformation because it can be very feudalistic. As a pastor, as someone who does counseling in my church, as somebody who's been working with people throughout all the years, it can get rather cynical because you see the same patterns. People have the same troubles, they deal with the same conflicts, and they don't want to make change. They want to have a sort of band aid on their circumstances. They want to see improvement, but they don't want to make that transformation that's necessary to see it. It can be rather feudalistic, but you're writing about transformation, having seen on the front lines how hard it is to actually achieve it.
Yeah, that's really true. And one of the things that I see a lot is, people seek out counseling because of some element of misery in their lives. For some, it's a lesser misery of, just some personality troubles, some sinful struggles, whatever it may be. Other, it's more kind of deep-seated, horrific circumstances that they've walked through, or things of that nature. But ultimately, it's misery that drives people to talk to someone else to try and help figure some things out. And one of the things that I tell everyone I meet with is ultimately, um, I am not the engine that drives the car of transformation. There's two people that do, and I'm not one of them. It's ultimately the Lord working in your heart to give you the desires to change, and then the power and ability to do it. Thinking of Philippians 2 there. And it's also you, is that individuals begin to change when ultimately they want to change. And
Mm,
yeah, I'll meet with some individuals that ultimately they're probably just not ready for counseling yet, right? The level of they're counting the cost because it is hard and it's costly to work to become a different person in some ways. That means that may require letting go of some things. It may require having some of your deep-seated beliefs challenged, or ways that you live challenged. Things that may have to give up that may not seem worth it in the short run, but then there's also that misery that's driving you here. And ultimately, every person who steps into my office that does experience change, they do it because they want it. And the Lord has captivated their hearts to help them see that what He's moving them towards is better than the things that they leave behind.
mm. Now, I don't want to say this too frank and honest, but it's one of the reasons why I'm not a very good counselor. I don't know why people still come to me because I struggle so much with this kind of cynicism. I think of having done this for enough time to realize that people don't really want to change. But I think in the other side of this, where I'm sure a lot of our listeners are thinking through this, is like, do have I seen change in my life? Am I seeing positive heart transformation in my life? One of the things that I like to talk about, especially with people, is that when we oftentimes we don't really want to change ourselves. We want to change the circumstances around us. We want to change the people around us, our partner in marriage, our children, our community at large. But when Jesus says this in the Sermon on the Mount, and particularly in Matthew 7, that if you're taking the beam out of your own eye and you realize just how hard it is to do that transformation for yourself, that makes a huge difference in seeing how hard it is for the person you're working with to change, to be able to see clearly to help your neighbor with the speck in their eye. But that's ultimately what you're talking about here is this has to be a personal, we have to change before we can see change around us, right?
Yeah, I think it's kind of, it's something of a simultaneous thing, right? Where we live in a world in which broken relationships abound, in which harm abounds. I mean, all you have to do is walk through Genesis chapter 3 or Romans chapter 3 and just see the list of brokennesses that we can expect in our world. Um, I think a lot of times we read passages like that and focus on uh, Romans chapter 3, where it says that their throats are an open grave, right? Death words tend to spew out of people. That's their natural inclination. Is that we oftentimes focus just on like, well, that's the default of every person, but we also have to recognize that that means that our relationships are going to be marked with that. And so we live in an environment where we ourselves are broken and others are broken. And there are some scenarios, I just want to be clear on this. There are some scenarios in which personal transformation, your own transformation, may be part of what needs to happen, but it's not ultimate, right? I do a lot of abuse and trauma counseling, and one cannot transform oneself into uh, causing their spouse to no longer be abusive. But in most situations that we find ourselves in, the complaints and the troubles and the challenges, you're right, we can't change our circumstances, whether it be health issues, whether it be financial issues, whether it be just particular worries, troubles, concerns, irritations, frustrations, and others. But what can change is the way that we interpret them. What can change is the way that we engage with them, and what can change is the way we respond to them as the Lord grows us in our hearts.
Hmm. Tell us a little bit about the central point of this book and the central point of what you mean when you talk about heart transformation. Why is that such a crucial component to seeing
Mhm.
change? I mean, I can change habits, I can change patterns, I can even change my environment, I can change the community that I'm part of. Why is heart transformation so important?
Yeah, I'd say the central idea in the book is that any human being can change in some way, shape, or form. In the book, I talk a little bit about unbelievers changing. I use the example of, if we have a spectrum, uh, maybe on one side, you can imagine the kindly grandmother who bakes scratch apple pies for everybody in the neighborhood, but isn't converted, doesn't know the Lord. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have like Hitler, who was a genocidal maniac whose actions led to a war that took like 40 million human lives or something like that, right? Uh, unbelievers, the unbelieving heart can be expressed through that kindly Nana actions, and it can be expressed through those horrific Hitler actions. And that unbelievers can shuttle back and forth along that spectrum, because it doesn't require a work of God to be kinder to others. It doesn't require a work of God to not be a genocidal maniac, right? Unbelievers can grow in transformation of how they live, and we're thankful for that. That's if we want to use, some old church documents. The Westminster Confession refers to that as civic righteousness. We're thankful when drivers are kind and don't road rage. We're thankful when we dial into, our insurance company and someone is helpful rather than unhelpful, whether the Christians or not. But ultimately, those kinds of changes aren't the kinds of changes that please God. It's civic righteousness. It's not moral righteousness. Moral righteousness is the kind of transformation, kind of righteousness that actually pleases God, and it's directed to the right end. It's driven out of a desire to glorify God. And instead of simply modifying our behaviors, it's changing who we are as people, where our hearts grow and are enlarged. And that's ultimately the product of the Holy Spirit. And so I wrote the book trying to identify those two types of change, and then also trying to answer the question, how do we tell the difference between the two?
Mm. And that question right there, it does look similar, and I think the lines have been very much blurred within our culture today, where people are drawn to things that are positive and uplifting,
Mhm.
and you know, the things that we want to see happening in our culture today. Identifying the difference is crucial, especially in a day like today, because where the center of truth rests and where that lies within our in our minds and even in our churches is really at stake here. What we're talking about when we're talking about change, heart transformation, it goes much deeper than just the surface level.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the question, naturally arises of how do we tell the difference? And um, I'd say there's two primary components to it. The first component is time. It's just time, right? When I got married, my some of the older men in my church threw a party for me before we got married, and one of the people who was there, he was my high school youth group leader. He's a retired lieutenant colonel from the Marines. Uh, Kind of a take take 20 milligrams of suck it up and call me in the morning kind of fellow. Love him, one of my favorite humans on earth. And he told me at this party, you can stand on your head in the corner for a while if you have to. And I remember asking him the question, what did that mean, John? And he said, oh, what I mean is that you can endure almost anything for a short amount of time if you want to, but it doesn't mean it's sustainable. And I think, all we have to do is look around and just, you think of a situation where perhaps, one person falls for another, and it's an unbeliever who is really interested in a gal who's very much a church going girl, loves the Lord, and he'll go to church for a while trying to win her, right? He may become convinced of, on the surface level, of religious things. All of us have perhaps been in an argument or fight with the spouse or something like that, and the doorbell rings, and suddenly that argument goes away and everyone's really, really pleasant. We can flip that switch, right? And then the person leaves and we resume the argument or whatever it may be. Um, all of us can have short-term transformation of who we are. But I think the question is long term, what is sustained? Are the fruit of the Spirit sustained? And then the second aspect is that you see this whole life integrity over time, right? So, there are non-Christians oftentimes occupy some of the fruits of the Spirit. We can think of unbelievers who are really, really kind. We can think of unbelievers who are really, really patient. But genuine heart transformation is going to be marked by sustained uh, growth in the fruit of the Spirit, all of them, over a long period of time through the bumps and troubles and disappointments of life.
I like how you reference the parable of Jesus and the sowing of the seeds and the realization in that where you have the different parts, you can see immediate growth, but it doesn't last, and you see that some are taken away by the ravens, the birds. Some are just scorched by the sun, and some grow up with weeds. But Jesus says you'll be able to tell by that which produces fruit and what is able to
Mhm.
multiply fruit. That's essentially what you're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that's fascinating that I actually didn't even notice in this passage, or I guess I noticed it, but it didn't really register until I was working through a lot of the writing process of this, is that of the four different soils, um, there's one that really clearly doesn't sprout, and that's the seed sown on the path that gets snatched away by the crows or the ravens real fast. But the other seeds all sprout.
Mhm.
Is that there is a response. My father used to say, everyone has a religious spasm or two in their life. And I'm sure that's not, you know, true for every human being who's ever lived, but I think there's some truth captured in that, is that all of us come to points where we're like, I need to be a different person than I am. My wife and I are watching the TV show The Good Place right now, which has been out for a while. So if you've seen the end of it, don't spoil it. We haven't made it so far. It's a fascinating show that's basically based around the question uh, of human change and how do people change and what are motivations for it. And it's not a Christian show, and so some of their conclusions are certainly different than ours. Uh, but all of us wake up at some point and say, I need to be different than I am. And how long does that go? What does our heart do when we get disappointed you know, when we seek to make changes and perhaps that spouse doesn't reciprocate? And that tests our motives of are we doing this before the Lord or are we doing this simply so that things get better? And certainly we hope that things get better. But that kind of stuff of actual heart transformation. It's proven by time and it's proven by ultimate growth. And that
Mm.
those seeds of the seeds that fell in the rocky soil, the seeds that and then got cooked by the by the sun, and the seeds that got crowded out, those were seeds that were healthy, vibrant plants at the beginning. All of us have the ability to look like we're changing, but it's time and fruit long term, right? It takes a long time for fruit to grow. Um, it's not like fruit just pops up the next day after you plant something. Over the course of our life, what's the general trajectory over a long sustained period?
Mm. I love that metaphor and that parable of Jesus, but also how we're talking about it in the idea of change and heart transformation. We're currently in a series going through the book of the Acts of the Apostles and seeing this really manifest as they're starting to realize that they can put their investments into short-term change or long-term change. And we see that throughout the book of Acts, that it is showing what long form change actually looks like, and the fruit of that, as we get the benefits of thousands of years later, the fruit, the church's growth and its spread in a very sustainable way, as opposed to just a flash in the pan.
hmm Yeah, absolutely. I think the Book of Acts, it's the story of a group of people who are changing and are continuing to grow in their knowledge and truth of the Lord. And obviously, so many of our epistles are written to those churches, and that
Hmm.
Paul is helping them see what does sustained personal growth before the Lord look like, as we as those churches start in Acts, but over time, as they're being changed from one degree of glory to another, how do we know that that church in Corinth was actually a church that had full of people who had experienced genuine heart transformation and not just hooked their wagon to the, kind of the new thing? Well, in First Corinthians, you see the confrontation of a lot of sin in that body. And in Second Corinthians, you actually see them having acted on some of the things that Paul had highlighted for them in First Corinthians, and that demonstrates that there was a rub. There was they wanted Jesus and they wanted these things too. Well, what happens when there's that collision between those two? And Second Corinthians answers so many of those uh, things for us, which we're thankful for.
Mm. So, who is this book written for? When thinking about transformation and the change of our hearts, who is the one to benefit from understanding how change takes place?
There were two different populations that I had in mind as I wrote this book. The first would be individuals who, are maybe vocationally in the same category as us. So ministry professionals, those whose lives are focused on helping people grow in holiness. Because as I meet with people, I want them to be able to help, or I want to help them identify the answer to the question of, am I really changing from the heart, or is this just out of my own effort? That's an important question. And for you as a pastor, Adam, I know you're asking the question like, in the lives of my people that I minister to, they want to be changing from the heart. They want to be growing not just in civic righteousness, but moral righteousness before God. And how can you help them identify maybe those where this change is coming from?
Mm.
I also wrote it for individuals that may not have a theological education, may not have graduate schooling. It's written at it's certainly a theological book, but it's written on a conversational level. And I wrote it for individuals in churches who, maybe actively participating in a small group as a leader or a member, or enjoy reading theological literature that's really heavily connected to life practice. So I wrote it to try and help people who are in the church and are lay folks, faithful lay folks, be able to ask questions of themselves and those around them, and then those of us who are more practitioners or ministry professionals to grow our ability to care well.
For our listeners who are thinking of this about this whole idea of transformation and changing and heart change, but struggle in the context of seeing that change in their day-to-day life. Maybe they're struggling with sin, maybe they're struggling with the culture and the environment around us. Maybe they're struggling through grief or some sort of abuse, as you do in your counseling. What kind of advice do you have for them in the context of seeing real change take place? If I can't change personally, how am I going to be able to help other people change?
Mhm. That's such a great question. You know, I know that all of us as human beings can identify things in our own life that we just wish were different, right? Like, I mean, Adam, if I were to ask you, hey, if I were to be able to tell you July 17th, 2023 is going to be a massive day of sin for you, you could probably, with some accuracy, predict what that day would look like. Um, and the same thing for me, right? Like I can probably tell you I'm not going to wake up that day and suddenly have a lot of questions over my gender identity. I have friends that would probably be the lane that they would really struggle with. And none of us are masters of our own hearts, right? We don't necessarily get to pick what we struggle with. But I would have my own issues that I could probably tell you, yeah, that's what that day's going to look like. Um, I think the Bible describes that as something of a besetting sin. We all have certain things that we're going to struggle with until we're with the Lord. And so, the question ultimately comes of mastery, right? Uh, is who is do our sinful struggles control us, or to where they're just running rampant over our lives, or are they the kinds of things that we certainly still stumble and fall in, but there's a trajectory of growth. And for me, as I meet with people, I'm more interested in what's the trajectory here, right? I've met with folks who have 20, 30 years invested in looking at pornography and don't even know what it's like to be an adult, barely know what it's like to be a human without kind of giving themselves over to this. And when there's that long period of just habit and history, it's hard to walk away from. And growth may look different than for someone who, has only recently begun with that. And one thing I love about the Lord is he knows where we're at and he seeks to help us grow. And what the main question is what's the trajectory? Over time, do you see a growing godliness inside of you? And all of us will reach different stages on that, different stops on the train, if you will. Um, but the question is, what's the trajectory? And if the trajectory is good, wonderful. And if it seems like you're just kind of stuck in a cycle over and over and over again, a lot of times that's where talking with someone on the outside can be helpful.
Mhm.
Ultimately, counseling. Uh, I think one of the illustrations that resonates a lot with my counselees is most of them feel like they're stuck in a maze and they've explored every path they can find, and there doesn't seem to be an exit. But we know from 1 Corinthians 10:13 that no temptation has overtaken us except as is common to humanity. And God's faithful, and with that temptation, He'll also provide a way of escape. And sometimes it's helpful to have someone come alongside and say, "Hey, I let me just have some eyes above you and say, I tell you what, turn left, turn right, turn right, turn left. And I think you're going to find an exit where you're going to be back in familiar territory where maybe you feel a little more confident to be able to handle these things." So I would just say to listeners, if you're stuck, it might be a time to go ahead and really seek out some help from a pastor or a Christian counselor that's going to really help you interpret your life and interpret the Bible well together.
For any of our listeners who struggle because they're in a relationship with somebody who brings great grief or sorrow to their hearts, whether it's a spouse or a child or a grandchild who is showing that they're not changing, they're not getting better, they're not showing
Mhm.
improvements, and this has become something of a central prayer. Maybe they've gone and gotten counseling. Maybe the constant message that they're getting back from people is that there's not going to be any change. There's not going to be any transformation. They're losing hope. What advice would you have for them?
Mm, yeah. One of the things I love about being a Christian is that um, we're able to just be realists, right? And I would say that there's two things that our Lord teaches us that are important that can be ballast in our hearts. And the first is we understand that we are responsible for what we're responsible for, and we're not responsible for other people. So, those kinds of situations, say it as a child who has walked away from the Lord, that is a point of deep grief for believing parents. And yet, at the end of the day, our theology, our Bibles teach us that what we're responsible for is to raise them in the way and admonition of the Lord, and they're responsible for their response to it, right? I graduated from a Christian high school, and I think there's maybe three of us from my class who are walking with the Lord, and there's about 20 of us that walked away. Um, what's the responsibility there? Well, all 20 of those individuals, they made their choices. They saw light and they decided, nah, that light's not for me. And there's a difference between grief and guilt. It is good and right to be sad and sorrowful over someone who has made poor life choices, perhaps walk away from the Lord, things like that, not growing in ways. But that's different than guilt, where ultimately the Lord hasn't called us to carry those burdens. I think a second thing is that we also just look at a Bible that we say, as long as there's life, there's hope. Um, there really only were a couple kings in the Old Testament who had a massive heart transformation that started off bad and ended up good. And one of them is listed as the worst king that ever was, and that was King Manasseh. He had the longest reign out of any king in Judah, 55 years. His grandfather was a grandfather or father. I'm forgetting at this point. Father was one of the best kings, and he grew up knowing what the worship of Yahweh was, and he sprinted as hard and as fast as he could away from that, and tried to undo everything his father had done. And then his nation gets destroyed, and he's sitting rotting in a prison. And the text says, and at that moment Manasseh remembered, and he was restored to his kingship and spent the last dozen or so years of his life trying to undo the damage that he'd done. And if you had to pick one king that was going to repent, that probably wouldn't have been the one that you would have picked. If you were thinking of New Testament characters, you stare at Zacchaeus, and it doesn't make a lot of sense for Zacchaeus to actually be one of the people who turns around, because he devoted his life to plundering and pillaging God's people out of just a deep hard-heartedness, and he sees Jesus and changes. My own grandfather was someone who hated Christianity, and then he got dementia, and he forgot that he hated Christianity, and he actually became a Christian at the very end of his life, having forgotten all of his why he had such animosity there. And so I would just say that life is long, and you never know. And what we don't want to do is act out of desperation, right? But rather out of a principled faith that says life is long, and as long as there's breath, there's hope. And I just don't know what the Lord may do. And so we don't anchor ourselves in this, kind of optimistic lack of realism, where we say, well, if I just try harder, God is going to transform that person. That's not true. Ultimately, it's them who will make that decision based off of what the Lord does in their hearts. And at the same time, we also don't give up hope, because death and trouble are mighty evangelists. And if we know one thing about humans, is that all of us, there's suffering in our future. And we never know what suffering might expose the weaknesses of our worldviews and drive us back to the truth of the Lord.
Mm. Such great encouragement and great hope in all of this, that when we walk and our steps are ordered, um, as I said before, Matthew 7, then we can see clearly how to help our neighbors if we make that transformation and we walk in that transformation. Could I ask you, Nate, to pray for our listeners in this regard and to encourage them as we think about all the ways in which God is at work in our lives and in the lives of those we love?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. Father, we are grateful that you are the one who's the changer of hearts, Lord. I think of so many places in your word that describe our hearts as being dark, and we cannot know it. There's none who naturally seeks after you, and anyone who does, it's because you have brought a dead heart to life, um, which is beyond our strength and beyond our ability. Thank you for sending your Son to die and rise again in our place, so that that kind of transformation can happen. Lord, for those who are listening to this and are tired of struggling against sin, I ask that you would breathe fresh hope into them. If they need to get help, Lord, I ask that you would motivate them to get help. If they need to endure, help them to endure. Lord, for those who are listening and are in situations that perhaps they need to escape because of hard heartedness, I ask that you would give them the ability, encouragement, and support to escape. And for those that are staring at others that may not be an escape situation, but just the the hard-heartedness of some causes deep sorrow. Lord, I ask that you would give them hope, and I ask that you would help them to continue to minister in faithfully. Lord, I'm so grateful that you give us in your word an understanding of how to be transformed, and then give us the power to slowly walk towards you. And I ask that you would bear us all to the end. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. We've been talking with Nate Brooks. His book is called Identifying Heart Transformation, Exploring Different Kinds of Human Change. It's a great resource and one I commend to you. In fact, I believe that this book is designed for each and every one of our listeners because, as I say all of the time, God has placed people in your life in which you have a tremendous impact and influence, whether you're a parent, grandparent, spouse, a member of a church, or even you're working through change yourself. This book is great for you. I commend it to you, encourage you to get a copy. And of course, if you want to find out more information, you can reach out to us at Songtime. Nate, again, I can't thank you enough. A great book and a great resource, a great conversation to talk about the heart of change. So thanks for being a part of the many voices for that one message.
Thanks so much for having me, Adam.